speaker. So last year, December 2017, I had the honor of attending a conference in Miami, Florida. It was amazing. But the keynote speaker there also was Sam. I came back from that conference energized. I came back and I was telling Mary Lou and the other board members, let's get Sam. Let's get Sam. Let's get Sam was my cry. And I am thrilled to have the honor of announcing our keynote speaker this year, Major Sam Cochran.
Thank you. As I say in Tennessee, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
I just would like to say that Sam is nationally known for his work in developing the CIT model. He was the coordinator of the Memphis Police Crisis Intervention Team, CIT, which started in 1988. This isn't a new thing, guys. And there was an outpouring of community partnerships. It's everybody working together. Like we said, collaboration. He holds a master's degree in political science and criminal justice from the University of Southern Mississippi. He retired from the Memphis Police Department after 33 years of service, which include numerous assignments, including coordinator of the Memphis hostage negotiation team. Retiring in 2008, Major Cochran joined the University of Memphis as a CIT project grant coordinator and as a coordinator of the CIT Center. He is passionately engaged in many services promoting CIT as a community program, more than just training. In addition to receiving the City University of New York John Jay College of Criminal Justice Law Enforcement News Person of the Year Award, he also is the National Alliance on Mental Health Illness named an annual Law Enforcement Advocacy Award after Major Cochran. Major Cochran is currently serving as chairperson for the CIT International. Please help me welcome Sam Cochran.
Thank you, Sheila. Just let it go down. I appreciate that long introduction, and I know it's written in your, I was going to say, I didn't want to interrupt her. I said, they can read, y'all can read, so she didn't need to articulate all that again, but I do thank you. And I wanted to, out of all the great things that in my life, the fact that I received a phone call several years ago from National NAMI, and they said they're going to name a National NAMI Award after you. And I said, well, I'm still alive. And they said, well, that's okay. You know, so I tell everybody when they hear about the Sam Cochran NAMI National Award that I'm still alive, and I'm very honored of that particular occasion. Also, I want to introduce the fact I'm not going to do it to Mary Lou like what I did another host. I've been in contact several times with Mary Lou. She's a wonderful host, and all the people, but I've been more in contact with Mary Lou, and she's just outstanding with regards to it. But I was invited one time to a particular city. Actually, it was in Los Angeles, and I was at a program, and so the host introduced me and everything, and I got up before a large audience, and I said to the audience, I've got something very personal that I want to share with you, and that I want to express this to you because I know that you all are very sensitive and will understand the things that I'm about to say to you. And so I'm looking kind of at the host, and a host of a conference does not want a speaker to come up to start saying things like, she was frantically, what is he fixing to say? And a host likes to be in charge. They like to know how everything's going to unfold in a timely way. And if things get out of order, a host or a person that is coordinating a conference or a committee gets really stressed. And I could look, and she was under stress, but I kept going. And I said, since you're such sensitive people, I'm going to share something with you that, again, I know that you will understand and appreciate me saying this. Now, in literature, not in theater, they call it a dramatic pause. And with that, I lowered my head down, got really quiet, and then I slowly raised my head up, and I leaned towards the microphone, and I says, I just want to let y'all know I have an accent. And of course, everybody started laughing with regards to that. And of course, it made the host of the conference a little bit more ease because he didn't know what I was going to say. I was at one conference, and a lady came up to me and says, "Oh, I just love the things that you're saying." And I says, "Oh, you like hearing about CIT?" And I said, "No, I just like the way you talk." So if you find yourself trying to pick out some words, I've never heard that word before, it's probably contributed to my accent, and maybe it's a word that I'm making up or just not pronouncing correctly. So the presentation today, when Mary Lou was calling me, and obviously from the fact that it was from Arizona, the first thing I said to her is, Arizona is doing really well with regards to CIT. And I says, you really want me to talk about CIT? I mean, y'all are kind of one of the leading states in all the things. And she says, yeah, but we still have a lot of areas that are not fully CIT. And she pointed out very correctly, we have some, CIT is now growing. See, at the very beginning, it was a first responder model. It still is, but now we're incorporating CIT into other areas. And corrections, obviously, now has its own flagship of CIT. And parole and probation is joining in with CIT. Paramedics are joining in with CIT. And so they're all kind of coming in under what we call a CIT umbrella. And so it is getting more and more exposure. But I want to kind of stay structured to my presentation about CIT being a first responder. And all those other things can come into play, and we'll get into that with regards to my presentation here today. Understanding CIT, understanding the importance of CIT, and sometimes making sure that we understand the consequences where CIT is really not CIT. And you can see up here on the first slide the introduction. For years, I have been saying that CIT is more than just training. And it's been a tagline. A lot of people have come to say, well, we're not really sure what this more is you're talking about. And I'm going to give some emphasis on the more. You're going to see me holding on to this book. You say, what is this, a comfort book? Well, no, not exactly, but I'm holding on to it for right now. I may put it down because it will become a part of the presentation a little bit later on. When things are written, okay, it becomes true. And so I'm going to tell you a story that's in this book. And I want you to know that I'm not making it up. And I'm not selling this book. It doesn't have anything to do with mental illness. We'll talk about it a little bit later on. But most of the time, I bring the book up, I set it down, and I do my whole presentation. I said, I forgot to hold the book up. And so I even make a picture of it. But again, I wanted to show you this is a real book. And a little bit later on, we'll talk about the story in that book. So, do you know who was arrested 172 years ago? And you might, at your law enforcement saying, I can't remember who I arrested last week. How much am I going to 172 years ago? I ain't got a clue as to who that might be. Well, let me give you the answer. The answer is on July the 23rd, 1846, a writer, philosopher, Henry David Thoreau. Now, you know your English literature, and you know Henry David Thoreau from your previous literature study, left his cabin in Walden Pond and walked to Concord, Massachusetts, and ended up in jail. Now, we'll get back to that a little bit later on. Now, let me go to a point where I call red flag, okay? Now, I want to introduce this early on because this will come into play of understanding CIT as more than just training on this. Now, a red flag in our culture oftentimes suggests a warning or a caution that should be taken heed to. Now, in 2006, there was an executive, a police executive research forum, had a committee, wrote a paper, and on that, they said, as we read in this particular paper on page 61, as we read about these incidents, now what we're talking about is law enforcement shooting events relating to mental illness crisis events that upset our communities. Often it says that the involved officers were trained in CIT, and we ask, how can this be? Now I had known this subject matter was going to be coming into play. This is the first time that it actually hit newsprint that other times of doing it. It's not uncommon to read about crisis events, and sometimes it hasn't been reported that some of the events are related to actually trained CIT officers. Now, I have to give you caution, just because you're CIT trained doesn't mean that you're not going to have a crisis event relating to a law enforcement shooting event. In fact, I caution people, whatever you do, do not promote your CIT program as never having a crisis event such as what is being articulated up here. And because nobody can guarantee you that. If they did, they're reckless with regards to how they're presenting CIT. It cannot be done. But nevertheless, it has been brought up that, wait a minute, if CIT is so great, why are things happening that we're troubled about reading about? And I think that's a fair warning with regards to that, and we'll learn a little bit more about CIT, maybe not necessarily really CIT. In fact, if you wanted to go to up to the top, CIT International, .org, and there's a subject matter called News and then Investigative Reports. Now all these little links, and I actually clicked on all of them. For some reason or another, I couldn't open up number 5, but each one of these links are Justice Department reviews where they've gone into a city and they have investigated the community or law enforcement with regards to their response. Not all of these were specifically about CIT. One of them was. One of them was about, not CIT, one of them was about law enforcement officers shooting many individuals who had a mental illness. The others were accumulation of other things that the Justice Department has reviewed, but when the Justice Department comes in to a community and to a law enforcement, they don't just look at one thing, they look at the entire scope of the agency. And they make recommendations to the courts, and to the courts they're saying, okay, we're going to order you to do this, we're going to order you to do that. So one of those particular communities actually started to move away from CIT. Those places had CIT programs, but as the years and the months go by, they drifted away from the core foundation of what CIT was. In essence, if I were to bring it down to something very simple, it became a generic training program. It became a good training program. And it was not a bad training program. It became a good training program, but it was not meeting the needs of the community of what CIT was all about. And therefore, many of these individuals ended up into a Justice Department review. Now, each one of them links is going to be over 100-something pages, and it has all kind of expert testimony with regards to what should be happening and how CIT should be viewed or should be considered. So if you're going to click on that and tend to print it out, be prepared to print out over 100 pages on each link. But you can review those in particular information and find find different information of what other people are saying about CIT and how it should be incorporated as a community program. In fact, in one particular program, they got so far away from CIT, they introduced the 40 hours of training into the training academy, and they gave it to brand new recruits. And they were expecting the same results as if they're giving it to senior experienced officers. Law enforcement recruits are usually at a very young age, and they do not have a comprehension of what CIT is about, or even an understanding about mental illness. In fact, I'm going to make this point earlier, and then I'm going to move on. Not too long ago, I'm a part-time trainer at our sheriff's agency, and I train recruits. And so I teach them about mental illness, part of their general recruit training. And I also teach in service to our agency. In the state of Tennessee, the Tennessee state says that every law enforcement officer has to have mandated 1 hour of training related to mental illness every year. So every year, every agency that has mental illness must introduce within their certification, yearly certification, at least 1 hour topic on mental illness. In our county, we offer 3 hours, so we're not limited. We have to have 1 hour, and our county says, no, this is important. We want to give every year 3 hours. So I teach 3 hours every year through our in-service. So last year, the chief asked me, he says, what are you going to teach on this year, your 3 hours? And I says, Chief, I want to go back to the basics. And he says, what do you mean? He says, I want to go back what I'm teaching the recruits. I said, I want to go back to the really fundamental basics of mental illness. He says, okay, you think it'll be good? And I said, I think it'll be good. And so, yes, we have a lot of senior officers, but we also have a lot of junior officers that are part of our makeup of our agency. And so I was teaching, I normally teach 24 hours to our recruits, and I was teaching only 3 hours. So I picked out different slides that I thought would be good for all of our deputies to kind of understand. And so I was teaching the 3 hour topic, and I looked in the back of the classroom, and there was one of our young deputies that I had taught the previous year. And so during the break, she came up to me, and I looked at her, and I says, you know, I'm teaching you, talking about during her in-service now. She now has 12 months on as a deputy sheriff. I says, you know, I am teaching you the same thing I taught you when you were a recruit. And she says, she looked at me, she says, yes, but it's different. And I'm sitting there saying, different? How can it be different? I pulled the PowerPoints from the same thing that I taught you and I put it together. It's only 3 hours, and she's saying it's different. I said, what do you mean it's different? She says, now I understand it. Now it makes sense. Now that's a very powerful statement. I knew that, but I needed for her to say that to me so that I could share with other people. What she's saying for her, when she was a recruit, she was in her early 20s. She didn't have a clue as to what mental illness was about. She had never had a mental illness personally within her immediate family. She had never been in a crisis where a crisis that involved somebody's kitchen, somebody out in the public, or in somebody's backyard, a crisis event. Yes, recruits are smart enough to go through a PowerPoint presentation, make sure they study the right questions, and answer the right answers to the questions in order for them to advance and become a deputy when a part of an exam that might be given. But understanding the questions and answer is totally different. And she had no experience. Now she's had 1 year of experience, and the things that I'm teaching is really impacting her in a very, very positive way. Now I have something to relate it to. Experience is great. I have been saying this from day one. I ask law enforcement officers when I come to teach them, I says, what brought you here today? And many of them will raise their hands and say, well, my sergeant, my lieutenant, my captain, somebody told me to come here, so I'm coming to training. And I says, no, that's not what brought you here. What brought you here is your experience. Your experience brought you here. And my training is going to complement your experience to where you really do become a much better performer with regards to crisis issues and crisis services. So as we move forward, this presentation is intended to accommodate these things. So in Arizona, you have many great things that are happening. When I was going around the room, I was listening to some of the things that you were saying, some of you from rural areas, and maybe you're at the very beginning of places. And then there are other places here in Phoenix, in Tucson, in Scottsdale. Wow, man, now y'all are champion leaders across the nation. There's only one other state that I think that would be complement to that of Arizona, and that's Ohio. And that's a pretty good state with regards to many of the things that they're doing. Y'all are very compliment of what y'all are doing with regards to your services and your linkages of services to that of care. And you're not just talking about crisis services, you're talking about vocation. I talked to someone from vocation. And you're talking about housing. I talked to somebody here from housing. There's all kinds of multiple layers with regards to making CIT successful. There is where the more really comes in. How do you make those connections to carry on a better quality of life, a better quality of care for people who live, struggle, and cope with mental illness? And that's what's important, and you have successfully done that in many places. Does that mean that you quit and go on? No. This is a starting point, and you are a beacon for many other states and many other communities to look for. And I am so honored to be in front of you. You have judges that are here, you have sheriffs that are here, you have administrators in law enforcement, administrators in mental health. You have advocacy here. Thank you, NAMI, with regards to your voice and your passion. And it's those kinds of partnerships that actually not only changes your community, but changes our nation. And there is something that we're going to talk about more. How do we make sure that we don't lose CIT? But these are some of the things that we're going to try to do today. So somewhere in here, you might be coming from a community that everything's wonderful and great, but I would suggest to you that you could also lose it. You got here through a very hard struggle, but if you're not careful, you could lose what you have. And you have to be a protector of what you have. The more is what's all important. And you can see some of the things. Engaging partners is very important. Infrastructures to systems is very, very important. Oftentimes that word infrastructure has to do with funding. And funding is very, very important. And that's something you have to protect. And that's something you had to advocate for. Systems and crisis services working together. It would be amazing that sometimes in the early part of the CIT development, law enforcement, I was representing law enforcement. If somebody would ask me, does law enforcement and mental health systems and services work together? And I would say, well, yes, they do. We're very nice. We wave at each other, we speak at each other, and we say things. But then we got into CIT at the very, very beginning, and we got close, especially within the training component of it, and we found out that we were not as close as we thought. With regards so there had to be some working to make sure that our partnership was real and had a purpose and intent. So oftentimes I go to presentation and I have law enforcement all in the audience, and I open up and I say, CIT is not a law enforcement program. And the law enforcement are looking around and say, well, why are we here? And I go on to emphasize, as the slide is emphasizing, CIT is a community program. That's what you are to purposely set your mind to. Accomplish CIT to be a community program so that there can be community ownership. You're going to hear me say it more than in more occasions, but CIT is about an identity, but more so it's about ownership. And I always caution people, you cannot own something you can't identify. So you have to identify CIT for what it's intended to do and not to make it some generic training programs like some people have done in the past and have not yet been successful. So this was an article that was written in 1999, actually by one of our NAMI members in Pinellas County. And so 1999, this was in the International Association of Chiefs of Police, a well-known national organization representing police all over the country. And so he wrote an article and they published it. 1999, that's a voice that's been around for a pretty good while. And this particular NAMI member, as they say down south, nailed it. okay? He really brought what CIT was about. I divided it up into three little short paragraphs here that you can make. And the very first one starts out, this is a unique partnership. A unique partnership. Wow, partnerships is important. Police, mental health, and advocacy. More than just training for the police. That word more than just training has been around actually longer than 1999. He's heard me say this since the very beginning when CIT was implemented, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But these particular words were very, very powerful for 1999, and yet CIT continued to move slowly. And actually, we just celebrated our 30th year. CIT was implemented 30 years ago. We are honored CIT has made such an impact across the nation, but we have many, many communities that do not engage in CIT. And I'm not just talking about CIT, the model, I'm talking about the community that are addressing the model to accomplish what, again, I'm going back to Arizona. You look at some of those champion communities you have a CIT first responder program, and you have developed an attachment to make sure that CIT is working. In 1988, when we implemented the first CIT program, we looked around, and I was part of the people that was looking around, and I says, you know, this is a pretty good program, but if we don't support it, it's not going to work. And what I was talking about supporting is we had some very poor mental health services within our community. So we had to work very, very tenaciously to address mental health services. You can have great programs, but if great programs are not attached to services, it's only going to carry you so far. And so those other layers of services need to be constantly made sure that are in place. So, what is CIT? Clearly, safety, safety, safety. In fact, I used the word safety up here 3 times because at the very beginning of our initiation, and I'm going to go into at the very beginning, but the mayor of our city summoned a community task force together and said to this task force, I want you to come up with a plan that will provide safety for the officers. They wanted you to provide safety for the family member, and I want you to provide safety for people who live with and struggle with mental illness. So it was safety, 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 and that was a pretty powerful message that the mayor of our city gave to a particular task force of people that were looking to see to make some things changes. So let's go back to the past a little bit. On the left is a 1987 news article. Now CIT was implemented in '88. This was an event that happened in 1987. So when I show these two newspapers, the one on the left is from Memphis, the one on the right is from the Washington Post, and they were writing about Montgomery County, Maryland, that just implemented the program. Montgomery County, Maryland is right next door to Washington, D.C. And so they implemented the CIT program in Montgomery County, Maryland. So I asked you, I used to say, I asked the leaders, what paper would you want to read in the morning when you go to your driveway and pick up the morning paper? Actually, I don't ask the leaders anymore because this is not just a leader question, it is you. What do you want to read in your morning paper when you pick it up and read the headlines? Do you want to read a headline on the left, or would you like to read a headline on the right? And then clearly I know the answer with regards to this. But again, the paper article was 1987. That was because of a shooting event that our officers responded to a crisis call from a family member that was reporting of their adult child, was armed with a knife, has mental illness, was not taking his medication, was cutting himself, and we dispatched several officers, and ultimately at the end of a brief encounter with this individual, he was shot multiple times and died. And that started that community task force. The mayor stepped up, it became political. Now, I suspect, I think when I say it became political, you understand exactly what that meant. It became political in the truest sense. But one of the things, before I go on there, I want to go back to 1986. That was '87 shooting event. 1986, our family members recognized that when law enforcement, my agency, I worked for the Memphis Police Department, when the Memphis Police Department would come to their homes for crisis services. 1986, we didn't have mobile crisis teams. We didn't have a lot of outreach systems. Well, family members, they said, we need help, and the only people that could reach help was the law enforcement services. And when law enforcement would be called, family members recognized that things didn't always work out. They would say sometimes the officers would get hurt, sometimes their loved ones, talking about their adult children, would get hurt, and sometimes family members would get hurt, and sometimes everybody would get hurt. And so they began, well, that's what NAMI does. NAMI is an advocacy group, and they take a message and they advocate for change. And so they began. Now, here's where the message gets a little bit kind of cloudy a little bit. Their message was that your officers are not trained. So they went everywhere. They went to the chief of police. They went to the mayor. They went to the council meetings. They went to the county commissioners. They went to the county mayor. They went to every leader they could. That's one thing about NAMI. They go to everybody. They don't leave anybody out. One of the things I always like about NAMI is they're the most prepared advocacy group I've ever seen in my life. Usually when I go and NAMI pick me up at the airport and they take me to make a presentation, I say, before I go, I want to see your trunk. And they said, well, why do you want to see my trunk? And I said, every really true NAMI person, if they're a really true NAMI person, they have a trunk full of literature. And I just want to see where your status is with regards to advocacy. See, you might not know what I'm talking about. The NAMI people know what I know. You know what I'm talking about. And the trunks are full of the boxes and the literatures. They're always ready to hand out literature talking about mental illness. Their passion is not just within words. Their passion is within action. And so they took action, but their message was, your officers are not trained. But that was from their personal perspective. I learned later that some of our family members would not call the Memphis Police Department. What a sad commentary, that you're representing law enforcement in a community saying, I can't call my local law enforcement. That's a sad commentary. And so the family members went and made their message. Now, when you go up to a law enforcement administrator and you say that your officers are not trained, that will get you the attention of that administrator, because then you're starting to talk about legal issues, okay? And so our chief started hearing that, okay, our officers are not trained. He immediately picks up the phone, calls our training academy commander and says, I got people here saying our officers are not trained, report back to me how we're training officers relating to mental illness. And then he picks up the phone and he calls a research and development. And not every agency has a research and development. Larger communities, agencies will have that. He says, find out what other agencies across the United States are doing with regards to training their law enforcement officers. And so we had 2 reports that were being initiated. The training academy came back and says, we're training our local law enforcement officers 8 hours of training specifically to mental illness. This is 1986. We're training 8 hours of our recruits about mental illness training. And our agency had contracted with the largest mental health center, and the training was actually being conducted by professional mental health trainers. And so we had expert trainers teaching 8 hours. Then the report came back from 30 other agencies across the United States, some the same size, some smaller, some larger. And Memphis was not the highest in training hours, but it was up towards the highest, okay? It was not at the ultimately high. There were some other agencies that had higher than 8 hours. Most of the training hours were 1 or 2 hours, which represented Memphis very, very favorable. So when that report came back, our chief says, well okay, this looks good, and he thanked the family members for bringing this to the attention of their concerns, and says, we'll continue to look at this, and we'll continue to study, and we'll get back with you. Now, in case you don't know what that means, yeah, you know what that means. Nothing happened in 1986, okay? Then 1987 come, that was the shooting event. Now, that was not the only shooting event. That was the shooting event that captured the attention of the news media. That was one headline. There was multiple headlines with regards to that. And a lot of things that were being said in those headlines were just not true. They're not true. That's when it got political, and that's when the mayor formed the community task force. But again, my point was, Memphis had a very tenacious training program that was conducted by mental health providers, yet family members were saying, our observation, the officers are not trained. So as we moved into CIT, it became pretty obvious that CIT, if you do CIT right, it's more than just training. Some people say, well, yeah, you're talking about those services. Oh, yeah, that's true, but I'm also suggesting that that CIT is about changing of one's heart. See, NAMI says it powerful when they talk about mental illness stigma. Actually, I don't like mental illness stigma. I really think if you really want to get up close and personal, you'd say mental illness prejudice. And so, well, wait a minute, you talking about me as being prejudiced? No. And see, sometimes law enforcement officers think that way. They think when people say things, they take it personally. You're talking about me. No, I'm not talking about law enforcement. I'm talking about a community. I'm talking about there's prejudice in the community representing people who live and struggle and cope with mental illness. You know, one time I wrote an article talking about in communities across the United States, you could have a person standing on a street corner and have a white cane with a red tip on it, attempting to cross the streets, and I guarantee you that there would be a traffic jam of people getting out of their cars in every community, assisting that individual to walk across the street. I'm telling you, there are people on the streets of America that are not literally carrying a white cane, and we're not seeing them. We're not seeing them with our eyes, and we're not seeing them with our heart. And that's where CIT is. It's a community program. It's a community passion in order to see the people who are not carrying white canes. The tragedy is still there amongst us. Arizona is doing some wonderful things. Don't lose it. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. All right, so CIT requires core elements, and we're going to talk about core elements as we move on. But first, we want to point out some anchors, and anchors is really community anchors. These anchors kind of keep CIT going. They make CIT a community program as it moves forward. With regards to it. Sometimes communities fit under a CIT umbrella. For example, like a county. A county might say, we have a CIT program, and they have multiple municipalities that attend the training, and they receive this, and then they go back to the community. Those partnerships are kind of a county type of partnership. They're working together in order to make sure that CIT holds on to a community identity. Sometimes you can have a county, sometimes you can have a regional effort, meaning that you might have multiple counties. If the counties are very, very rural, sometimes there's a regional area between 3 or more counties, and they will come together under a CIT umbrella. That works well. Some communities, such as Ohio, has got just about every county in their state impacted with CIT, and they have a state CIT program. And that's a state program is something that I think helps to sustain the success of CIT. So there are many anchors, and those anchors have to do with partnerships, law enforcement, mental health, and advocacy. Other partners can be there, but truly these are the core anchors that make CIT successful. Here's a tagline up at the top. You can't have a journey without a destination. Your destination is CIT. You have to stay focused on that. When you're coming together into different committees or different people are assembling together, it might be that they're saying, well, we want CIT. Do you understand what CIT is about? That's where you have to kind of invest a little time to explore CIT so that it doesn't become a generic training program. There's a lot of information out there. We talked about CIT International having a lot of publications, and a little bit later on we're going to show you some other great organizations that's got some great information. So you need to read and study and invest a little time making sure that CIT is not just a training program. So the core elements was designed and written with regards to some structure to give you with regards to outlining the success of CIT. You have ongoing elements, you have operational elements, and you have sustaining elements. Ongoing elements has to do with the partnerships we've been talking about. It has to talk about networking, people coming together in order to make some planning sessions. You have to kind of stay together. I like this picture here of this conductor. A conductor is a very, very important person with regards to an orchestra. And a conductor It's one that keeps everybody together, and you have those leaders. Listen, I already met 2 or 3 different judges here in this community. Judges are very, very important because they represent leadership within the community. A community oftentimes look at their judges that are elected as judges, and they're saying, that's a person we can trust, that's a person we can depend on, that's a person the community oftentimes look for guidance with regards to this. When that judge in a community says that we have too many people in the criminal justice system that should not be there, that's a powerful voice. That's a powerful person to be an orchestrator, part of a leader when a community comes together. Those judges that assemble themselves into a steering committee or a task force, and they show that kind of leadership, it gives confidence and it gives leverage to actually accomplish some things. That's very, very powerful. Earlier, the judge, I was very taken away by his words of wisdom and his words of passion with regards to this. A few years ago, it's been several years ago now, the mental health courts kind of come on the circuit, and so I'm familiar with several of the mental health courts judges throughout the country. And there was one particular mental health judge, Judge Ginger Wren, out of Fort Lauderdale, and she's gotten a lot of national publicity, and she's made a lot of conferences. And most of the time, we would early on, especially when mental health courts were getting a lot of attention, we would come together and we would see each other. So we have this little bond together, and we become friends. And I would see her, but every time I would see her, I'd always go up to her and I'd say, Judge, and she says, hi Sam, how you doing? I said, I'm doing fine, but I just want you to know my role is to put you out of business. And she always smiled, and she says, I hope you do, Sam. I hope you do. That's a judge that has passion to understand, yes, there are people that have to go into the criminal justice system. But what I'm saying to you about CIT is, CIT says not everybody has to go to the criminal justice system. We have to work tenaciously. I used to get a little angry because when the mental health courts started hitting the circuit, so to speak, man, there was a lot of grant money come to it. You go back and look at some of those early things, it was all about mental health courts, and they were pushing the mental health courts and all this, and they'd have little subsections where you could do a CIT. And I always said, you know, I was a little jealous because of the publicity, because mental health courts are great, don't get me wrong. I think they're great, but mental health courts mean people go into jail. And sometimes law enforcement officers misunderstand. They read a newspaper that says, our county has just opened up a mental health court. And law enforcement officers want to help people. That's why they became who they are. And when they're reading the headlines, see, law enforcement officers, you want to know about systems and how it works? Talk to law enforcement officers. They'll tell you how systems work. They have this thing now, it's called mapping, okay? And a lot of times they bring in all these, and I suspect many of the places here have already had system mapping is what they call it. They have a lot of great organizations that do it, and they usually bring in chiefs and all the important people around, and they do this mapping and everything. You know who they leave out sometimes? They leave out the officer that works at 10 o'clock at night or at 2 o'clock in the morning. You know, there are a lot of directors that understand how things work Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., but they don't have a clue as to what's working at 10 o'clock at night or 2 o'clock in the morning. Those officers know. They say, well, yeah, you've got an arrow pointing here as a link of services that law enforcement can go to, but they're not open at 10 o'clock at night. They're not open on Saturday. No, they're not available. So you could put an arrow there saying that's a receiving facility for officers to use, but you have to put a question mark that they're not available during the hours I work. And so when you're talking about mapping, you have to look at systems that accommodate 10 p.m. crisis as well as 2 a.m. crisis. We're going to say that. So that's very, very important to do that. A conductor is important. Those are the leadership. So CIT is not an ACME. Some of you that are young don't know what an ACME corporation is. When you grew up with cartoons, you always knew about the coyote and his ACME plans and everything. Anyway, that's something y'all can look on somewhere, find it, but it's out there. Anyway, the partnership is the building of the partnership and the cooperation is very, very important. So it's about building relationships, and those relationships are very, very important. Those relationships just didn't happen this week. Look at this room, and my understanding for the last 2 or 3 years, those relationships have been ongoing. This organization does well for those kinds of relationships to keep going. And it really says a lot about you, but it says a lot more so about your community that you're representing. What we're going to do. So the partnerships are absolutely, we've already talked about the importance of leadership. I like the picture on the right where the young lady is doing all the work and the other guy, he's just not engaged, you know. You need to make sure that engagement is there. And that means people coming together, knowing each other better and working through some of the things. So the engagement requires this shared ownership. Remember earlier I talked about ownership? Ownership is very, very important, but the fact that when you start to own something, you start to invest in that ownership. I want every chief to have CIT program to say, oh, we have CIT, that's my program. And then if you go to the mental health director of that community and say, oh yeah, we have CIT, that's my program. And if you go to the case managers, oh yeah, we have CIT, that's my program. And don't get me started on case managers. I love case managers, but do you realize that we have case managers across the United States? I have to say this because I really love case managers. It's a great system. But you know there's some case managers, they have 40, 50, 60 clients. That's not case management. That's drive-by case management, but that's not case management. So we have systems that have good ways, good things and to accomplish things, but then they're overwhelmed not to accomplish the great things that they're tasked to do. Many of the case managers, they're very young in age, and they're looking for a way to move up into the mental health field and get out of the case management field because case management is really tough. You got 50 clients, and you're supposed to service 50 clients. Well, you know, that's a system issue that the community needs to be examining. Are our systems actually working with regards to this? So those partnerships, is very, very important. System issues in mental health are very, very important. And there's a couple of ways of looking at systems. Remember earlier I told you that law enforcement officers know very well whether or not a system is working for them or not. And many times when a system is not working, law enforcement officers will turn to a system that works for them. In that particular, what I'm trying to articulate to you, the county jail is always open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they have a very good system of getting people in a timely way. So if I'm a law enforcement officer, and I pick a person up under the emergency commitment law and I take them to a facility that requires me to be there 4 hours if I'm lucky. Sometimes it's 8 hours. Sometimes I'm there 14 hours. And many times they come back and they say that the person is not committable under the state commitment law. Therefore, the person that was brought in for an evaluation is back into your care. 14 hours later, back into my care. What am I going to do with this individual? What am I going to do? I cannot just turn this individual loose. I brought this individual because I recognized that there was a crisis services. You're saying he doesn't meet the commitment law of our state, but you're now putting this individual back to me. I am not, look, when you start looking at some of these service centers, they're overwhelmed. Hospitals is a hospital emergency room. There's a tremendous amount of responsibilities at a hospital emergency room. And when law enforcement officer brings an individual in relating to a mental illness crisis, there's an orderly process that's supposed to take place. There's actually procedural things like medical clearance that has to take place. And these things take time. And so many times law enforcement bring individuals in, and I hear from law enforcement officers saying they really don't want us here. They really do not. They say, why are you bringing this person in? And then wait for hours. Law enforcement officers are faced with some challenges because if they're in the hospital for 2 hours, 4 hours, or 8 hours, or 14 hours, and many times their fellow partners are out in the community and they do not have an immediate backup. and they're concerned about their fellow officers that are out there. I'm in a hospital waiting for hours, and my partner is out on the streets of the community, and if he needs my help, I cannot go there. And that's really stressful for law enforcement officers. Officers want to do their role, but they want to hand off that role. One of the things that, well, since I'm talking on that subject, I'm moving around a little bit, but y'all follow me. I can see it in your eyes, and I appreciate that. I talk to the officers all the time about the eyes are the windows of the soul, and that's a training concept that I'll share with you another time I see you. Anyway, the point with regards to law enforcement officers is that they want to help people, but they also have other pressing demands. And many of those demands oftentimes are weighed with how can I fulfill my role as a law enforcement officer, and sadly they're faced with a situation of going to mental health services and waiting 4, 6, 8, 14 hours, or taking them to the county jail on a minor misdemeanor type charge relating to some type of conduct, which could be within the legal elements of the law, relating to some type of disturbance on that. And many times the law enforcement officers will choose that way because of the demand of their attention for other community services that they're needing. And so that's where you have to make sure that the community that's about to invest in crisis services, and you've done this in Arizona and many other places, in Tucson, you created a facility to accommodate those kinds of services, and I think in Scottsdale as well. And I don't want to leave all those other places that are out there successfully doing that, but what you did was, that was not always the case. It started in Tucson with a few family members that took this idea of CIT, and they says, CIT is more than just training, because usually when people hear CIT, they say, okay, yeah, give us training. Well, yeah, I got it. We need that training. But those training is only going to carry you so far. You have to have those systems that, like a crisis assessment center, or have better cooperations within the hospital. I worked with a hospital that their average stay was, for a law enforcement officer to go in, was 6 hours. That was the average. If officers brought somebody in on emergency commitment, the average stay was 6 hours. They got together at the table, law enforcement and hospital administrators and mental health, and they were talking, they were able to reduce it down to 3 hours. And so, well, that's still a long time. That's a 50% saving. They were ecstatic about that success. They were able to reduce something from 6 hours down to 3 hours. They were very happy with that. So every community addresses its needs and the urgency of those needs when that partnership starts to come in together and you start working with regards to that. I talked to a hospital administrator one time, and I'm saying, now wait a minute, your policy is that the officers have to wait there until after the medical clearance and after you make a decision whether or not this individual is going to be held for further involuntary commitment proceedings or not. Yeah, that's right. And I says, do you really need a law enforcement officer there if this individual is a very elderly individual struggling with attempt suicide issues and thoughts? Do you really need a law enforcement? And he says, no, we could probably handle that. Oh, why don't you dismiss the officer then? And so when you start looking for ways of cooperating, you'll be much more successful with regards to that. So look at those problem issues, look at those concern issues. The crisis assessment centers, I like crisis assessment centers. I won't argue which is better, because clearly a hospital emergency room has medical attention, and many of our people who live and struggle and cope with mental illness have medical issues and need to come into play. But with regards to what I have seen, many crisis assessment centers, they have different names, they have multiple layers attached to it. Those are really good. So you can bring an individual to a crisis assessment center and they could be evaluated for state for further involuntary commitment proceedings, or if you have an assessment center that has a social detox, that has access to medical detox, that's good, because as you know, many individual has co-occurring, and officers might find somebody in for public intoxication and only seeing the substance abuse only when the individual goes into a social detox facility, the individual sobers up and says, wait a minute here, we got mental illness crisis issues going on, and then they can converted into that of other services. And then there's crisis stabilization. Crisis stabilization is voluntary. See, I came from a state that we had many years ago, managed health care. And one of the things that we lost in managed health care, we had a crisis stabilization. They says, no, you can't have it no more. And I said, this is an important part of our crisis services. It was voluntary. So officers saying, hey, let me take you somewhere to get you some help. Many times our officers were talking to individuals and say, yeah, okay, I need some help. And they could go in for 3 to 5 days with regards to crisis stabilization, voluntary. Okay, it was really good. And it didn't take long. Our managed health care wiped that out. And then I kept saying this is a big mistake. I was a lieutenant. Nobody listens to a lieutenant. You know, I don't have that big of a voice to outline the people who's running the managed health care in Tennessee. And they said, no, that's not going to work. And I said, well, you're making a big mistake. We don't care. We're going to do it. And so they did it. Only for a little while later, says, you know, I don't think this is working out too well. And he says, maybe we ought to create something for those individuals that need other crisis services. So then they come back and they say, hey, Lieutenant, we hear your words now. We're going to create something for you. And I said, oh, you're going to give us a crisis stabilization back again? No, we're going to give you respite care. And I said, I've never heard of that word. What's respite care? You see, the mental health people, they live in a world all their own language. I don't know what respite care is. And I says, tell me what this word respite care means. Well, respite care is kind of like a back bedroom in a mom and pop house where a person can go in and chill out and watch TV and recover in 2 or 3 days. And I'm saying, wait a minute. I says, the people that our officers are dealing with on the street, they are not going to work out well in a mom and pop back bedroom watching TV. That is not the crisis stabilization I was talking about. Yeah, but that's what we're going to do. So that went on for a little while, and that didn't work out either. So now we have a crisis stabilization that's part of our assessment center, which is really, I think, works out really well. So those are things. And some of the crisis assessment centers have mobile crisis teams that are attached there. Now, personnel is always a big issue when it goes to it. So mobile crisis team is mental health providers that are out in the community. If the crisis assessment center is having an influx of people coming in for crisis services, they can bring mobile crisis team back in to accommodate personnel in order to get things back into their control, and then they move the mobile crisis team back. Now we have we have co-responders with regards to this. Many places across the country are incorporating that, and that's another layer to make CIT successful, and I think that's very good. And I don't know what just happened, but that's not good. So you can do something. I probably hit something. No, was it? Well, I mean, that's a good way of saying hurry up. So we're doing okay. Okay, so we're at the steering committee. We already talked about a steering committee is important, and a steering committee can come together either through an appointment by a leader, or a steering committee can kind of come, hey, let's just all get together and talk about this. And these are things that people come together and start planning, start looking. This is where a steering committee can bring in a team to help you map out crisis services on this. So ongoing elements is another core element, and then we move into operation elements. And this is where the officers are part of training. Dispatchers need to be incorporated into training. It's hard to move dispatchers into a 40-hour training program. Try it if you can. If not, give dispatchers, communications operators some additional training. It's very, very important. They're the first contact with people. A long time ago, I was interviewed by CNN, and they said, tell us something that nobody's ever asked you before. And I said, what, you want me to make up my own interview? And they said, well, yeah, maybe something like that. And they says, what is somebody that's never asked you? And I says, okay, I got something. And I says, years prior to CIT, people with mental illness would never call the Memphis Police Department. After CIT, we have people who live and struggle and cope with mental illness calling the Memphis Police Department, I need help. That is a tremendous savings. That is a tremendous care that we're able to transform that fear and into where the community feels comfort in understanding crisis services, and I think that's a critical role. So CIT, the basics, is law enforcement. This is kind of a general overview of how the CIT program works as a first responder. Remember now, there's multiple layers of CIT. This is your home base, first responder, okay? The dispatcher at the top. You'll notice the two law enforcement officers on the next line. The two officers by themselves are CIT officers. And yes, the other picture is just a picture I got off the internet of a group of officers. It's intended for that to be like a shift. So officers have 24-hour coverage, you have a shift. Out of that shift, two of these officers are CIT. The others are not ready to be CIT officers yet. Every officer has training, but they're not CIT officers. I'm looking for judgment, maturity with regards to this. I want some kind of selection process. Most rural chiefs and sheriffs, they know their people. So they can select people. In larger agencies, there may be some type of selection process that they go through. One of the things that some of the agencies are doing is pulling disciplinary charges on the officers. Disciplinary charges on officers does not reflect that they're bad officers. They usually entail a lack of judgment or maturity. They made a mistake. And so this is a way, if we have some disciplinary actions of an officer in the past, it may not be, that officer may not be ready to be a leader. We want a leader. So, and this particular group of officers, if a call event comes out through dispatcher relating to mental illness, one CIT officer is going to be dispatched to that call. Other officers will be joining that officer. By policy and understanding, the CIT officer is the leader. The leader is very, very important. If you want to perform at a crisis event where things need a leader, CIT needs to be that example of leadership. Then the other officers will follow. In time, other officers can say, I want to be that too. I want to be a CIT officer. And we want that volunteer. Sometimes officers are told to go to CIT training. That makes me a little nervous. And I've heard, sometimes officers are told, and you don't have an awakening of the officers. That's a pretty risk. That's a risk of sending somebody to CIT training told, and the whole week they have a bad attitude and they're not changing their disposition, and that hurts the overall team. So that's a risk. There's a difference between told and encouraged. For example, as a supervisor, I know the men and women that I supervise. And so when a vacancy comes open in CIT on my shift, I may ask for volunteers. Sometimes people don't volunteer. And so as a supervisor, I will call Mary or Joe in and I say, Mary, I know your skills. I know how you work. I like your performance. You should consider joining CIT. It would be good for you. It would be good for your community. And it'll be something that our agency needs and our community needs. You really need to think about that. If I'm doing my role as a supervisor, I can encourage Mary and Joe to join CIT. And just simply because I asked them, me reading out an answer, anybody want to be a CIT officer, come up here and sign up. Now, that you might not get some people to sign up. So I'd want the supervisor to get engaged in people that they know are going to be that way. Shift supervisors know their people. There's no question about it. You got some people that are skilled. Sometimes you have a small agency and maybe there's only 4 or 6 officers on the shift, and maybe every one of them are outstanding, and maybe every one of the supervisors did train all 6 of them. That's great. Just be a little selective as to who you're putting into a leadership role. Maybe they're not ready yet to be CIT, but you have some kind of awareness of who you're putting in to be a leadership. I think is very, very important. Wouldn't you not do that for a SWAT team? You don't just let people in and say, well, I want to be a SWAT team member, or I want to be a narcotics officer. No, there's a selection with regards to who you're bringing in, and that selection is important with regards to crisis services. So supportive operation elements, these are things that are very important with regards to it. Sometimes money comes into play, especially with regards to system issues, and sometimes it takes time. Usually in developing a CIT program, there is broken into two types of goals, short-term and long-term. Short-term is something you can fix cooperatively. Long-term usually means that it's likely to take some kind of funding. So long-term, you start directing what does our community need. And I would suggest to you that in Arizona, you have been part of that long-term planning. That's why you're successful here today. When you look at Tucson and what they did to pass the bond issue to create a hospital to accommodate crisis services, that was a wow moment for the community. That was the community came together, and communities don't just go and pass bond issues. Okay, that was where the people took charge, took ownership of who they were as a community. And that's something that you don't, just because you're a small community, so we can't never do that. No, you can. The little lady, the little man down here kicking the word can't, I like that. That's really good. CIT training operations, 40 hours, that is not likely to be changed in order to make, to be a real CIT program. Sometimes people say, I can't send somebody to 40 hours of training. Well, yeah, you can. You have to do a little planning. And sometimes they say, we have to pay overtime in order to send somebody to 4 hours of training. Okay, then you need to work on your budget, people, and saying, we need a line item budget that if I send one person to a 40-hour training, I have X amount of dollars to accommodate overtime. And budgets have to be planned in the future. So if you start now planning for next year, have a line item budget specifically for overtime, specifically only for training, so that you can pay for overtime. And so, well, I don't think we'll get a commissioners or a council people to do that. Get your NAMI voice, okay? Get your advocacy, get your community together to go before the budget hearings and saying, we want a line item budget to accommodate overtime for one officer to go to CIT 40 hours of training. So there's all kinds of things that you can do. You have to put passion to will with regards to it. Training, some potential problems, trainers not being prepared. Sometimes you can have a class size that's way too big. The reason I say it's way too large is because that you do a lot of verbal de-escalation training, and that requires practice. And if you have a class of 40, 50, 60 people, not everybody's going to be able to participate in some actually scenario practice. So you have to make sure the class size, we're recommending anywhere from 20 to 30 and try not to go too far over that. And you can see some of the other topics here. So CIT officers should be selected. We talked about that. And training should be part of, should be relevant to the officer. It should always emphasize safety. You know, one of the things when officers come to training, they want to make sure that the training is going to be accommodating to safety issues. That's very, very important. If you get a trainer in that does not understand the law enforcement culture and tramples over officer safety, the officers will shut that person down, and you have really discredited the CIT training program. Safety has to be incorporated with an understanding and needs to be emphasized. Those relationships, training also has to be connected parts. You see the pieces of the puzzle. So as you move through the training week, those other components need to be connected as you're moving away. You say, well, I don't see a connection there. There is. There's a connection there. So if you look at what is being taught, every learning objective should be visualized within a lesson plan, and those learning objectives need to be carried over into a transformation from Monday to Friday. And so look at your training objectives and see if there's a learning connectedness with regards to it. Okay, on Friday afternoon, most CIT training programs have a graduation. This is where I ask the question, okay, I know what you're walking away from. You're walking away from 40 hours of great training. The question, not necessarily to the officers, the question is back to the community. What are you walking into? I am thankful in Arizona you have many other linkages of services that you're walking into. Do you realize that in many places across the country, they walk out of Friday and there's no other linkages of services of care. And all we're doing in places like that is we're just being nicer to people, still taking them to jail. You know, what are we doing? What are we doing? I got to hurry. I know time's going away here. Ongoing elements, then we're followed by what we call sustaining elements. Sustaining element means that it's going to have to be not only a program that's going to last for a year, but a program that's going to last for 10 years. Some of those other programs that I showed you earlier under those linkages, 6 years to 10 years, they started drifting away. Sometimes that drifting away became a way of minimizing CIT as only a training program. Sometimes a new chief or new sheriff comes in and says, we don't want to do that. Okay, those partnerships have to be in place, and those partnerships have to be passed down to new partnerships that come on, so that that message of CIT means being sustainable. So research articles help to understand CIT. There's a lot of research articles out there. Michelle Saunders, one of our former vice presidents of CIT International, made a comment in 2017. I am concerned that sometimes mental health and advocacy are not fulfilling their rightful placement as to CIT ownership and leadership. This displacement or absence fails to initiate or achieve community changes that are vital and necessary to structure and sustain CIT as a community program. I think that's a very powerful message that needs to be incorporated. So here's some of the research places that you can go and click on. They have all kind of research relating to CIT, information to learn more about. I think that's very, very important. Dr. Amy Watson is one of our great researchers that's done, her and Michael Compton and some other great researchers. Dr. DuPont has done some great research on CIT, and to read some of the things that they have posted about CIT makes CIT a program that needs to be implemented. Sometimes people want to just see the research. The research is out there. You need to review some of the research. Sustaining CIT has an identity. One of the things about an identity, all CIT officers, many of CIT officers are wearing a CIT pin. It makes a difference. That ownership of a pin actually transforms an individual into their personal identity as to who they are. That officer wears that CIT pin with a sense of ownership of the role that they're playing as a leader, and it's very, very important. With regards to award programs, are very, very good. It helps to bring the community together to recognize the great services of our CIT, and not only CIT officers, but oftentimes in award programs, mental health professionals are part of the award program, dispatchers are part of the awards program, multiple people are brought in. This is a community awards program, and it really gives them great honor with regards to this. Here's some of the things that has to do with a refresher course or an in-service course. If you're not doing a refresher course and in-service, I would strongly suggest you do that. Many of these topics is nothing more than a further accumulation of additional training. Most professionals, leaders, and other professionals have some level of an in-service. Many of our CIT in-service, they go to 40 hours of training and they never go back to training. No, you need to bring those individuals back. It's hard. You say, well, another 40 hours? No, I would suggest 8 hours. And the time limit within 12 months if you can, no later than 18 months. Bring those officers back to some recently CIT International partnership with Synovian Pharmaceutical, and we introduced, and also the Epilepsy Foundation. And that we went to 4 different communities across the United States: Miami, Columbus, Chicago, and Albany. And we introduced 4 hours of epilepsy and then 4 hours specifically related to needs of that community CIT. And all the officers were saying, why are we getting this epilepsy? Why are we getting this epilepsy? And through the training, we brought NAMI in with that too. NAMI was part of this particular training. It was amazing of the linkages between crisis issues relating to epilepsy and crisis issues relating to mental illness. Number one was a tremendous frustration over stigma. There's stigma within the epilepsy world as well as stigma within the mental illness world. And bringing those together, the officers started to see, oh, okay, we understand this better. So anyway, it was part of a refresher course. These are some of the other subject matters that are very important. I put this picture of an old train up here. Sometimes you go to a community and say, let's do CIT. And they say, no, we're doing training. We're okay. We don't need to do CIT. And what I say to the people is, you keep the CIT train moving. You say to people, okay, the CIT train is moving. We're going to come back, and if you're ready when we come back, we'll pick you up and you'll go with us whenever you're suited for that. So keep the CIT moving. Can CIT be lost? Yes, it can. Sometimes you can miss the point. We've already indicated all those other linkages where CIT was lost. They had very sound CIT programs that diminished. They diminished, and one of the diminished was that the champion CIT leaders in the community moved away. They were not replaced. CIT became a generic training program with no real purpose, no really infrastructure was addressed, and we were having training, but nothing really changed within the community. You need to look for some of these things that were there. Many of you are not going to know Dr. Torrey. The people from NAMI will know Dr. Torrey from a great champion. He's written many books. He's a psychiatrist. He made a point with regards to mental health services is all about responsibility and accountability. Mental health services, he's right on that. Everything, if you're in the mental health field, you're going to say, yeah, a successful mental health field is about responsibility and accountability. And I say to you, that's what makes CIT successful, if you have responsibility and accountability is attached to CIT as well. Dr. Torrey was talking about it from a mental health field, but I'm saying the responsibility and accountability works for CIT. But that's not all. In fact, that's why I'm holding this book up. And this is up here, it says, this is an introduction. I have not read this book. I bought this book because in the introductions, there's a short story the author tells about this particular event. He says, let me tell you a short story about how I made $960 an hour consulting with a homeless man. And you just say, hey, that's a pretty good deal. $960 an hour consulting with a homeless man. Let me tell you the story. So Patrick was one of the authors here, and he was going to lunch or dinner. And so he's walking to, and this is in San Francisco, and he's fixing to walk in. He sees a homeless man holding a big cardboard sign up, something that you have seen on many other occasions within your community. And this individual is holding this sign up that says, homeless, please help. 3 words, homeless, please help. That's all he said, okay? So Patrick goes up to him, and you can see the man was struggling, and so he reaches in his pocket, and he has $2 in his hand. He says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you $2, and I've got to go into this restaurant, and I've got to be there for about 2 hours, and when I come out again, if you're still here, I'll give you $5. And so what have I got to do? He says, well, I want to change your sign. And so the homeless man said, let me get this right. You're going to give me $2 now. Yeah, right. I'll give you $2 now. And you want to change my sign. And if you come back out in 2 hours and I'm still holding the sign that you're going to make for me, you're going to give me additional $5. And Patrick said, yes, that's exactly right. So they made a deal. So he gave him $2. The man handed him the sign. Patrick turned on the back of the sign, pulled out a marker, wrote on the marker on the sign, gave it back to the man, goes in. 2 hours later, Patrick is coming out and looks across the street and sees the homeless man holding the sign. So he reaches in his pocket, gets out $5, getting ready to give the homeless man part of the deal. So he's walking up to the homeless man, and the homeless man turns and sees Patrick coming. So the homeless man starts running over to Patrick. And he says, thank you, thank you, thank you. And Patrick said, I could see him. Man, he was so happy. Before he was kind of down and out and kind of really sad, but now he's just full of excitement and everything. And Patrick starts to hand him $5. He says, no, I'm going to give you $10. And Patrick says, I can take $10. No. And the man was real insistent. He made him take $10. And you're sitting there thinking, what is this all about? Why does the homeless man want to give Patrick the $10? And it's all about the sign that Patrick had had sent him or had changed on there in regards to it. And you're saying, well, what was the message that Patrick had put on this man's new homeless sign? And the message was, what if you were hungry? He changed it from 3 words to 5 words. What if you were hungry? What if you were hungry? And it became personal with regards to this, which brings us back to Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau, ended up in Concord under arrest. It was personal to him. He would not pay his poll tax. And that tax had to do with slavery, and Henry David Thoreau was totally against slavery. He says, I'm not going to pay it, I'm not going to pay it. So Henry David Thoreau goes into jail. It was personal to Henry David Thoreau, just like the message of what Patrick did. I failed to tell you the $960. The $960 that Patrick equates to 1 hour, it took Patrick 30 seconds to change a sign. 30 seconds to change a sign. He gave the man $2. The man gave him $10. That's a net profit of $8. So $8, you have to do the math. $8 for 30 seconds equals to $960 an hour from a homeless man. So that's the story on that, but the real message there is that it was personal. The personal message was, what if you were hungry? What if you were hungry? So the real and personal message comes back to you. What if you had a child that had mental illness? What if you had a husband that had mental illness? What if you had a wife who had mental illness? What if you had a brother that was had mental illness? That's personal. Henry David Thoreau says, I'm not paying my taxes. It's personal. I do not believe in slavery. And so he was visited, while he was in jail, he was visited by his long-term, another person Henry Wadsworth Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And so Ralph Waldo Emerson came to visit Henry, and he says, Henry, what are you doing in there? What are you doing in there? I hear you're in jail, and I come here, and you're in jail. Why are you here? And Henry looks up and he says, Waldo, that's his personal friend. He says, Waldo, that's not the question. The question is, what are you doing out there? It was personal. It was personal, and Emerson thought the same way. Henry took it that personal to take action, and that's what it's about. When things become personal, we're almost through. When things become personal, that's when things start to change. When you're a judge and things get personal, things change. When you're a sheriff and things come personal, things change. When you're a chief and the case comes personal, things change. When you're a patrol officer and you're on a crisis event and becomes personal, things change. When you're a mental health case manager under a tremendous amount of responsibilities, it becomes personal. You give it your all, and then you give more. So this is one of our NAMI members. She's passed away now, and her message is very, very passionate. Betty Chapman. She made all the graduations. She always pinned the CIT pin on a CIT officer. It was personal to her. This is one of our CIT officers that I wanted her to tell a video clip. Now, I must tell the people that are doing the video, you've got to turn the videos off, the movie things. I cannot allow you to make a copy of what this is about. So we got that? Okay, good. Make sure you cut that off. This officer is following the core elements of CIT, but for whatever reason, they're calling their program something else that's different. And that's okay. That's a community doing that. But I would prefer that we stay true to those initials CIT, which stands for Crisis Intervention Team. And a lot of times people think team means a team of law enforcement officers. No, no, no. The team is a community team. It's a community spirit where that ownership comes together to change things. You're doing great in Arizona, okay? But we got 49 other states that still needs to be promoted in a way of changing things. We need to change our nation. We need to change our states, our counties, our local communities. We can have great crisis response, but if we don't have those layers of infrastructures by which to address the needs of individuals, such as homes and jobs and things of nurturing, of care, of treatment and level of services, we're only going to be putting Band-Aids on things. We need to kind of come to the attention that CIT is more than just training. It is about a gateway by which communities can actually change and enrich the lives of people who live, struggle, and cope with mental illness. My last comment, okay, has to do with the word recovery. Now, that word has been introduced within the last several years, and you hear a lot about recovery this and recovery that and everything. And I would suggest to you that many law enforcement officers are not taking on what that word recovery means, okay? Many times that you would ask, I've asked some law enforcement officers, well, how do you fit into recovery? Usually recovery to a law enforcement officer is somebody else. That's where the mental health people provide services and assistance, and recovery happens after an individual is going through layers of services relating to crisis issues. And I says, no, you're very much a part of recovery. See, I want the officers to have an ownership of their role as part of recovery. Recovery starts at that crisis event. Yes, that recovery happens at that crisis event. That officer is nurturing an individual through crisis. That officer is moving that individual into community crisis services, which needs to be in place in a seamless way, okay? And then that handoff takes place, and then further recovery takes place. They either go into other recovery services of nurturing and care of an individual. We are introducing an understanding of recovery in our in-service. We're introducing recovery into the dialogue. So if you're in mental health and you're a trainer and you have occasions to talk to officers, make sure they understand that they are very much a part of recovery. If you're a family member, you're always greeting your law enforcement officers. One of the things about family members, they hug you a lot. I had to teach my officers, I says, no, they're going to hug you. And they said, why are they going to hug us? Because they love you, man. They love you, okay? So be sure that when you're hugging your officers, tell them that they are a part of recovery. And people who live and cope and struggle with mental illness, stand strong. Make your voice count too. You're a trainer. If you're before a CIT class, you're a trainer. Anybody that's presenting to law enforcement officers or training, don't minimize the interacting with people with lived experiences. Make sure that everybody takes an ownership as to who they are. If you take ownership of something, then you can identify it, and you can make sure that it becomes sustainable within your community. Thank you. You've been a great community.
Thank you. Thank you, Major Cochran, and those of you that would like to engage with Major Cochran tomorrow afternoon from 1 to 2:30, he'll be facilitating, or just, I don't even want to use the facilitate, because the word facilitate, really, it's an open exchange where you'll be able to talk one-on-one with him, ask questions, share concerns that you think he might be able to help you with.